Once again, thank you so much for joining us this evening in our Camden Conference Community Events program. Tonight, we're going to be speaking with Andrea Stanley Hester. She is going to be talking about Brexit. Her presentation tonight is called Brexit at 5. How's it going? So to tell you a little bit more about these Camden Conference talks, I'm going to hand the program over now to Jane Nice, representing the Camden Conference. Thank you, Jane, for being here. Perfect.
Hi, yes, I'm so glad to be here. My name is Jane Nice, and on behalf of the Camden Conference, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program. We'd like to thank Camden Public Library for making these programs possible, and we'd like to thank the World's Affairs Council of Maine for sharing Andrea with our community. The Camden Conference is a nonprofit, nonpartisan citizens forum driven almost exclusively by volunteers from our community. The mission of the Camden Conference is to foster informed discourse on world issues. And in keeping with that mission, we offer a series of community events across a number of different libraries up and down the coast that are leading up to our annual weekend conference. So please refer to our online, if you would like to see what those community events on a whole are, our website, and you can see in there on events, if you check that, you will see a whole calendar for those. If you want to see all the wonderful recordings of those that have already passed, you are welcome to do it by going to our news section, and it will give you a list of all those that have been recorded already. These are free events, and they're intended to provide background on the annual topic and to touch on areas related to the February conference that may not be covered in our 3-day format. The views, opinions, and positions expressed by our presenters are theirs alone and do not necessarily reflect those of the Camden Conference. So this year's conference, our 35th, is Europe, Challenged at Home and Abroad, and will take place February 25th to the 27th, 2022. The board of directors has decided to have the 2022 conference live and in person, not at the Opera House, but at a nearby venue with sufficient room for space seating it'll be at the Strom Theater, which is at the Camden Hills, don't know the name, Regional High School, as well as streaming online as we did last year. So COVID protocols will be followed at the venue as necessary, following their rules for those venues of that size. And information on tickets will be available soon, and members will be able to purchase them first. I would also like to mention some great news for us in Maine, that Philippine journalist and recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize this year, Maria Ressa, is going to be presented by, we're going to air her 2020 Camden Conference talk on Thursdays, Speaking in Maine. It'll be on Thursday at 2 p.m. So tonight, let's see, I'm sorry. It's my pleasure, of course, to introduce Andrea Hester. And she is the Vice President of the World's Affairs Council of Maine, an instructor at Osher Lifelong Learning at the University of Southern Maine. She was previously an editor-writer for the president of Harvard and administrator of the International Visitor Center in the Office of the Marshal at Harvard. She has a bachelor's in modern European history from Tufts University, master's degree in government from the Harvard University Extension School. And we are delighted that our local resident, so to speak, from North Yarmouth, who resides there with her husband and 2 daughters, is here to fill us in on how Brexit is doing. So thank you so much for being here, Andrea. We appreciate all of your insights on something that was part of our news for the last 3 years, I think, for news cycle. So I'm looking forward to this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane, for that very nice introduction. And thank you, Julia, and the Camden Public Library and the Camden Conference for hosting us this evening. And thank you all for being here with us. I'm very pleased to know that you're all interested to hear a little bit about Brexit and what's been going on with it. And I promise to finish before the Red Sox game starts. So what I'm going to do is talk just a little bit about the referendum itself, the aftermath, the negotiations and final agreement, and then finish up by talking about how's it going today. So without further ado, 5 years ago, British Prime Minister David Cameron called for a referendum on a long simmering question in the United Kingdom. Should they leave the European Union? Cameron felt strongly that the UK should remain because there were so many advantages to doing so, including freedom to travel, work, study, retire anywhere in the 28 countries that made up the Union. Other people like Boris Johnson, who was the mayor of London until just before the vote, were adamant that the UK had to leave the EU to, as they said, quote, take back control in order to unshackle itself from onerous and unjust regulations and forge its own path forward. So on June 23rd, 2016, after a hard-fought and contentious campaign by both the Leave and the Remain camps, the UK voted. And here we have the result. Remain, 48.1%, Leave, 51.9%. And as you can see from the map here, we had most of England and Wales, which is the very western kind of looks like a province there, but it says 52.5%, that's actually Wales, voted to leave. Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to remain, as did the area around the city of London. So this was a big shock to many people, not only in the UK, but around the world. People who voted to leave were even shocked by the result, many of them. And so we can see how some of the newspapers reacted to the result. The Sun, which is a tabloid in the UK, and other tabloids, which were very much in favor of leaving, were very happy. The Economist, not so much. And this, I think, is a good example of the difference in sort of opinion on the referendum and how people reacted to it. So what happened after that? Prime Minister Cameron resigned and was replaced by Theresa May. You see here, he said, the British people have made a very clear decision. I think the country requires fresh leadership. I don't think it would be right for me to try and be the captain. In March of 2017, Theresa May triggered Article 50 of the Treaty of Lisbon, which sets out the process by which member states can leave the European Union, which had never been done before, so this was all new to everyone. Article 50 gave the UK 2 years to negotiate an exit deal, which by any assessment promised to be a complicated and messy divorce. The UK had to negotiate a new relationship with the European Union, create new bilateral trade deals with many countries, including the United States, and revise British laws as needed once EU law was withdrawn. Should they have a hard or a soft Brexit? And what did that mean? Basically, it refers to how close the UK would remain to the EU. Should it pull away hard or should it go slowly, keeping some aspects of the relationship intact? For example, should they remain in the single market or the customs union? Theresa May's government negotiated with the European Union and brought back potential deals to Parliament, which had to endorse any agreement. 3 times the House of Commons said no. They were getting nowhere, and finally the EU had to agree to extend the exit deadline from March 29th, 2019, which was the 2-year mark set out in the treaty, to October 31st of that year. But by early June, with the agreement still stalled, Theresa May stepped down as Prime Minister, quite defeated, as you can see in the photograph there. She was replaced by former London Mayor and Leave campaigner Boris Johnson in July of 2019. He insisted that the UK would leave the European Union on October 31st, deal or no deal. He was quoted as saying that he would rather be, quote, dead in a ditch than ask for another Brexit extension. In fact, he came up with a new slogan, get Brexit done. And you can see here, this is a good photograph of Boris Johnson. He's a very colorful character and very charismatic, and he's very prone to doing these sorts of PR tricks, some might say. But he got into a tractor here, and they had a wall built, and he crashed through the wall. It was quite a dramatic thing that happened. And, you know, some people might find that cheesy, but other people thought it was great and thought he was doing a great job. But Parliament fought back and passed a law that prevented the UK from leaving the European Union without some sort of deal. They didn't want a hard Brexit. This is something that the hardline Brexiteers were very upset about and called, quote, the Surrender Act. So the clock was ticking toward October and the pressure was on. There were a number of sticking points, but two of the major problems before they could come to an agreement were fishing rights and Northern Ireland. So first, fishing rights. Any European Union country can fish in the waters of any other European Union country. And you can see here a map of exclusive economic zones. This basically shows the European Union in green. Switzerland in the middle there is not a member of the European Union. And then the purple is all the areas where everyone in the EU can fish. It's their whole economic zone. You can go anywhere. This is called the Common Fisheries Policy. But British fishermen were not happy with this arrangement. They felt that it was important to regain control of British fishing waters, and many people agreed with them. It became very contentious. But interestingly enough, fishing is only a tiny fraction of the overall economy in both the UK and the EU. According to the BBC, in the UK, fishing is only 0.02% of the British economy. And of course, in the EU, there are some landlocked countries that have no fishing fleets at all. So why all the fuss? Well, for the fishermen, it was mostly economic reasons, right? They wanted to have more of their own waters. They wanted to have to be able to catch more of the fish in their own waters. But for many people in the UK, it became a symbol of national pride. Remember the sort of nostalgic idea of the British Empire. The sun never sets on the British Empire. They considered themselves to be a seafaring nation. And so there was a lot of nostalgia and cultural connection to the idea of the United Kingdom as a fishing nation. So this really spoke to many people. The other major problem was, of course, Northern Ireland, which has always been contentious. You may remember the period of time called the Troubles in the late 1960s to the late 1990s, many years of violent conflict between Protestants and Catholics. And for many years, there was a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. There were checkpoints, towers, snipers, some of which you can see here in these photographs. But all of that ended with the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, brokered by Maine's very own George Mitchell. The problem now is that the Republic of Ireland is a member of the European Union. And with Northern Ireland having left the European Union, this is now the one land border between the United Kingdom and the European Union. But you can't go back to a hard border after all that time and all that effort to get to the Good Friday Agreement. You just don't want to see checkpoints on the land border between these two countries. So what do you do? So those were very difficult problems, and it took a long time to work something out. In fact, Boris Johnson, who said he'd rather be dead in a ditch than extend negotiations past October 31st, ended up having to do just that. the British government agreed with the European Union to another extension from October 31st to January 31st, 2020. But then finally, Brexit Day was indeed on January 31st, 2020, ending 47 years of the United Kingdom being a member of the European Union and its predecessors. Of course, it doesn't end there. Then began yet another transition period of 11 months to finalize the deal. So what did the final agreement look like? Here we have a picture of Boris Johnson with Ursula von der Leyen, who's the president of the European Commission. After years of at times torturous negotiations, a deal was finally struck on December 24th, Christmas Eve, 2020, which would take place on January 1st, 2021. Some of the highlights of the agreement included travel. UK citizens will now need a visa to travel more than 90 days in the European Union. They'll need to, in many cases, purchase travel insurance. There will now be roaming charges on phones and paperwork for pets. There's a pet passport for the European Union that no longer applies. And so every time a British person wants to travel in the European Union and bring a pet, they have to have health certificates for each trip. And of course, they have to use separate lanes from European Union citizens at the border, which is longer and slower. Second, relocation. If they want to move to a European Union country, or a member of the EU wants to move to the UK, people who already live there have certain protections that are grandfathered in. But many people will now need to apply for residency, get paperwork, and meet requirements like having a guaranteed job. There's no more automatic right to work, travel, study, and retire as there was before. With regard to trade, so they had unlimited amounts of zero quota and zero tariffs on each other's goods. But there's also lots of new customs paperwork, special licenses and certificates that are now required. There have already been significant delays and backlogs at ports like Dover. Also, the United Kingdom is free to negotiate new agreements with other countries, like the United States. But the European Union is still its largest and most important trading partner. For the EU, the UK is third after the United States and China. Qualifications and services. Professional qualifications are not necessarily recognized anymore. Doctors, lawyers, chefs, other professionals will need to check each country's rules as they may need new certifications. Service businesses like banks have lost automatic access to EU markets and are operating under certain restrictions. A deal on the services and financial industry has not yet been ironed out. On security and data, the UK no longer has automatic access to key EU security databases and vice versa, but they can each request information from each other. That, however, takes more time. And if you're conducting a terrorism investigation or something, or a criminal investigation, sometimes time is of the essence. So it's definitely something that's harder to do now. The UK is no longer a member of Europol. But on the other hand, the UK still has a very robust intelligence operation and is still a member of the Five Eyes group, which is an intelligence group that includes the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. For fishing, you see here the map I showed you before, and now the new map. Over the next 5.5 years, the United Kingdom will gradually gain a greater share of the fish from its own waters. So on the map on the right, you see, ignore the yellow, which is the non-EU area, but the purple and the sort of peach color is the area where it used to be all one, but now the peach color is where the United Kingdom has its territorial waters. And the purple is where the European Union waters are. So the UK will gradually gain a greater share of the fish from its own waters. The EU agreed to give up 25% of its existing quotas. Of course, the United Kingdom could choose to ban EU boats after that time, which would be in 2026. But if they did, the European Union could tax British fish or deny British boats entry into European Union waters. So it's really behooves them all to come up with some sort of agreement, and it will be subject to annual negotiations. And finally, Northern Ireland. They came up with the Northern Ireland Protocol, which says that the European Union agrees that goods can flow freely from between Northern Ireland and Ireland without checkpoints on the border. So you see where there is a land border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, there aren't going to be any paperwork or customs checks there. Rather, that has been moved out into the Irish Sea. So when goods come from Great Britain, which is England, Wales, and Scotland, that island there is called Great Britain. If you add Northern Ireland, then it becomes the United Kingdom. It's a little bit confusing sometimes, but when you go from Britain to Northern Ireland, the checks will be in the ports between those two places. And that prevents a hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. In return, the UK agreed to protect the European Union's single market by enforcing checks on goods entering Northern Ireland from Great Britain. But the final agreement was seen by many as sort of a bare bones severance deal rather than an ideal springboard for future relations. It leaves many issues to be negotiated later. Still, both sides saw it at the time as a victory. So how's it going? Well, for one thing, the EU has become a bit more popular. Just after the referendum, Leave campaigner Nigel Farage, who's the head of the who was the head of the UK Independence Party, or UKIP, and is now the head of the Brexit Party, he said that other EU countries were envious of the United Kingdom and that there was now talk about other countries leaving. For example, he told the Danes, "The European Union's finished. It doesn't work. You know, we just had the honor in Britain of being the first country that rejected membership. You know, you could be next. It could be Denmark next. It could be Dexit." Farage also predicted that other countries would want to leave, like the Netherlands, Nexit, and France, Frexit. In fact, he predicted at the time that the European Union would collapse within 10 years. In addition to him, other Eurosceptical right-wing politicians like Marine Le Pen in France and Geert Wilders in the Netherlands crowed that it was the end of the European Union as we know it. This turned out, of course, not to be true. In fact, public support for the European Union and the euro surged during and after Brexit. People looked at how hard it was and said, yeah, maybe leaving the European Union is not so easy. Maybe it's not such a great idea. So once they realized that voters were not enamored of leaving the European Union, Eurosceptic politicians have now pivoted for the most part to the idea of reforming the European Union from within. But it's not a rosy picture for the EU overall. The UK was an important member of the Union, which has now lost its third largest member by population, and perhaps more importantly, its second largest economy. This loss diminishes the European Union's economic and political clout on the world stage. Next, Scotland. Scotland voted by a significant margin, 62%, to stay in the European Union. There's always been a significant Scottish independence movement, and there had been a referendum in 2014 to decide whether or not to secede from the United Kingdom. At the time, the no vote won 55% to 45%. And the reasons were that people were sort of averse to the risk. They didn't want a hard border between Scotland and England. And of course, Scotland does get many financial benefits from London. So it was, within 10 points, but they've decided to stay. In the latest election in May of this year, the Scottish National Party, which is pro-EU, won, but they fell just one seat short of an outright majority. Recent polls indicate that more people would vote today for Scotland to become independent and rejoin the EU than not. And First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has indicated that she wants another referendum on independence. She said that the election results meant that there is simply no democratic justification whatsoever for Boris Johnson or anyone else to block the right of the people of Scotland to choose our future. And she insisted that holding a referendum was now the will of the country. But realistically, that probably will not happen again for some time. For one thing, she has her hands full dealing with the COVID pandemic, and she said that a referendum would need to wait for that situation to clear up. And secondly, the Prime Minister is absolutely opposed to another referendum anytime soon, perhaps for obvious reasons, and he needs to sign off on any referendum. So it doesn't look like things are going to happen for that for a while. And then there's the City of London. London voted massively to remain, mostly due to the fact that it's a more cosmopolitan area with a wealth of diversity and lots of young people who don't even remember a time when the United Kingdom was not in the European Union. So now what? London has long been one of the world's great financial centers. Is that still the case? As with everything else, COVID muddies the picture. Every industry has taken a hit from the pandemic, and London's financial services sector is no different. There was a lot of talk about companies moving out of London to the continent after the Brexit vote, and that has certainly happened, though the pandemic has made it harder to move anywhere right now. And there are some temporary regulatory arrangements in place until 2022 to ease the transition. So it's still unclear. But many jobs and firms have set up headquarters elsewhere, maybe keeping an office in London, but they've gone to places like Dublin, Paris, Luxembourg, Frankfurt, Amsterdam, and even New York. But European Union firms will now also need to set up offices in London as well. So there's a little bit of back and forth there. To quote Sir Howard Davies, the first chairman of the UK's Financial Services Authority, it seems like, he says, quote, "It seems likely that London will remain Europe's largest financial marketplace, but it will no longer be the continent's de facto financial center. There will still be a profitable role for London, but the golden age of the city as Europe's financial capital will recede, as golden ages tend to do." And then there are the two major issues that I talked about earlier. First of all, fishing. How's that going? Despite the assurance that British fishermen would have no trouble at all exporting their catches into Europe, a number of them have had just such trouble, in some cases having to throw their catch back into the water rather than let it rot on board. There have been sometimes massive backlogs and delays with reams of new paperwork to be filled out and processed. And French fishermen have complained that some of them have not had the access to British waters that they were promised. On May 6th, things came to a head at the Channel Island of Jersey. Now you can see on the map on the left how close the Channel Islands, which are British, are to the French coast. Very, very close. A flotilla of around 60 French fishing boats protesting new restrictions protested it by blocking the harbor. In return, the British sent 2 Navy vessels, which if you look at the pictures on the right, in the horizon of each picture, you can see the British Navy vessels sort of keeping an eye on what's going on. They were later followed by 2 French patrol ships who came in as well to monitor the situation. This is hardly ideal. And the boat on the bottom picture is not on fire, but they were setting off fireworks as a type of protest. In fact, the French Minister of Maritime Affairs said that she was revolted by the treatment of the French fishermen, adding, "We're ready to resort to retaliatory measures. Concerning Jersey, I'll remind you of the transport of electricity via submarine cables." Jersey, the island of Jersey, gets 95% of its electricity from France. So that was a very thinly veiled threat. In the end, the French fishermen did back off after talks with island officials, but the long-term problem has not yet been resolved. And what about Northern Ireland? The new customs border in the Irish Sea has not proven to be the panacea that was hoped for. The new and onerous customs barriers between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK have led to a number of unintended consequences. First, an increasing number of mainland British companies have decided that selling to Northern Ireland is too cumbersome and have stopped or curtailed doing so. Boris Johnson is trying to get around these issues by delaying some regulations on outgoing items, at least until January of 2022, so that British firms can have more time to adjust, which in a way is a tacit admission that the government underestimated the problem and is really simply not ready or able to fulfill its part of the deal. Second, the British government is dealing with serious unrest in Northern Ireland itself, especially among the unionist parties who say that the protocol in effect separates Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK. In fact, over the past few months, there have been a number of unionist protests, some violent and reminiscent of the Troubles, as you can see from these pictures. These pictures are not from the Troubles, they're recent pictures. Dozens of police officers have been injured while trying to control looting and rioting in Belfast and other areas. In addition, one of the unionist parties has threatened to pull out of the Northern Ireland Assembly if the deal isn't scrapped, thereby forcing a snap election. There is a growing concern that the Good Friday Agreement, signed 23 years ago, could be in danger. This is something that both Joe Biden and French President Emmanuel Macron, among others, have directly spoken to Prime Minister Johnson about. But the Prime Minister's attempt to handle the situation by pushing out the enforcement of regulations goes squarely against the deal, which is a legal treaty his government signed with the European Union, and Brussels is very unhappy. The British government, somewhat defiantly, is trying to renegotiate the protocol to lessen its negative domestic impact. Initially, the European Union said that it would only entertain minor adjustments, not a wholesale rejiggering of a signed and sealed agreement. But more recently, the European Union has relented a bit, proposing some significant concessions. For example, just last week, the EU proposed that checks be reduced by 80% on a range of supermarket goods, with the caveat that they be packaged and labeled in such a way that shows they are for sale in the UK only. So there are a number of very British type supermarket goods that haven't been able to go back and forth between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Sausages in particular, a certain type of British sausage. And this, now they're saying that they would be able to do it, but they would need to be packaged in such a way that they would not be able to circulate throughout the rest of the European Union. They've also proposed a consolidation of paperwork for goods being shipped to and from Northern Ireland, and to cut customs paperwork by half. They also proposed concessions to make it easier to afford and get certain medications and other goods. The UK's Brexit minister, David Frost, said, "I think the EU has definitely made an effort in pushing beyond where they typically go in these areas, and we're quite encouraged by that. But obviously there's still quite a big gap. And that's what we've got to work through today and in the future." One of the major sticking points for the British, which the European Union proposal did not address, is the oversight of the European Court of Justice when it comes to adjudicating disputes about EU law in Northern Ireland. They want to replace it with an arbitration system similar to other international trade deals. But the EU has ruled out changes to this part of the protocol, which it considers to be a politically expedient demand for domestic audiences in the UK more than anything else. The hope is that both sides can come to agreement by the end of this year. But the UK could reject the EU's concessions and demand a full renegotiation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. If that doesn't happen, it's possible that the UK could suspend the protocol or parts of it by triggering Article 16, which sets out the process for taking unilateral safeguard measures if either side concludes that the protocol is leading to serious, quote, economic, societal, or environmental problems. however each side defines that. It's pretty broad. The UK government has already stated that it believes the threshold has already been reached for them to trigger Article 16, but they're choosing not to invoke it just yet. If they do so, it would be a major escalation and could eventually lead to a trade war. And finally, on a more macro level, how has Brexit affected the UK's role in the world? In some ways, it has clearly diminished. No longer part of a large organization that has a multiplying effect on power and influence, but the UK has always punched above its weight. It still has a seat on the UN Security Council. It's a member of NATO, a member of the Five Eyes, and it will chair the G7 and UN Climate Conference, COP26, in Glasgow this year. And it's important to remember that the British Commonwealth itself, combined, makes up close to a third of the global population. The UK and 53 former colonies, which is about 2.4 billion people. And the UK, even just by itself, is still in the top 10 of global economies as measured by GDP. It's currently about number 5. And the government has published a 100+ page blueprint for the UK's international role post-Brexit called Global Britain. It is an integrated, quote, integrated review of security, defense, development, and foreign policy. Greater emphasis will now be placed on security at sea, in space, and against cyber threats. It de-emphasizes land forces in Europe, but not Atlantic security. It tilts toward the Indo-Pacific, including the South China Sea, India, and Japan. For example, the controversial new AUKUS alliance, AUKUS, with the United States and Australia to help the Australians develop nuclear submarines. It supersedes a $66 billion Australian deal with the French to make diesel electric submarines, which the Australians came to view as inadequate for their long-term needs, given the rise of China's aggressive behavior in the region. And as you can see from this editorial cartoon, you have the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia standing on the submarine. And you have France and the European Union looking quite upset. And then on the right, you have China looking very, very angry. And then Taiwan and Japan looking on sort of smugly. So the British government is very pleased with this first tangible victory in reminding the world that post-Brexit, the UK remains an important global player. It also reaffirms the UK's special relationship with the United States as a trusted ally. And of course, like I said, the French are very upset. Emmanuel Macron recalled the French ambassadors to the United States and Australia, the first time that has ever happened. It's not clear why they didn't also recall the ambassador to the UK, though reports in the French media said it was to make the point that France views the UK as a bit player, unworthy of such a grand gesture. Maybe, but perhaps it was also the delicacy around outstanding Brexit issues that made the gesture a bridge too far. That said, it cannot have helped the relations between London and Brussels or Paris. So, as of right now, 5 years in, the verdict is still out on the wisdom of Brexit. There have been notable failures and notable successes, and a lot will hinge on whether or not the UK and the EU can iron out their differences in a way that is, in the end, mutually beneficial. Time will tell. And with that, I'll take any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Andrea. At this point, I would like to encourage you in the audience to go ahead and locate the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Go ahead and type in a question. We'll be sure to read it aloud to Andrea in just a moment. Before we do that, let's get started with Jane Nice from the Camden Conference. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yep. Hi. That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrea. I had so much, such better grasp, I feel, of how they have gotten to where they are in 2021 with the movement to the agreements, et cetera. And now where the issues are. And in part of that, I would love to get your sense of now, how is the EU feeling about how they are doing now with Britain gone? As you mentioned, while they are more popular in many ways, because Brexit was so difficult, they've also worried because they have lost their second largest EU economy. So is that effect being felt, somewhere in the many negotiations there with the state of the EU today?
I think there's no question that the European Union has felt the loss of the United Kingdom for economic and political reasons. The British have always been sort of uneasy in the European Union and its predecessors ever since the end of the Second World War. It was sort of one foot in, one foot out. And, there were many times when other countries in the European Union thought, oh, the British, they're such a pain, why don't they just leave or something like that? But then when they said they were going to leave, people said, oh, well, wait a minute, that we don't want you to do that. I remember reading that Angela Merkel had said basically like, if you decide to come back, we'd love to have you back. So it's clearly a blow. There's no way of getting around that. But I think the Europeans have done a very good job of sort of, saying, all right, well, we got to get ourselves together. How are we going to deal with this? Trying to negotiate the best possible exit for the British. Mm-hmm. The United Kingdom will always remain an incredibly important neighbor and friend. Geography is destiny in some way. You're not getting rid of the British. They're not getting rid of you. You've got to come to some sort of agreement. And I think for the most part, there are exceptions, of course, but I think for the most part, they're sort of, determined to really try to work something out. They've been, I think, pretty flexible with British demands, depending on the issue, but they've just recently, agreed to cut customs paperwork by half. And, all those things I said, they have reached out just this past week to the British to figure out, how are we going to deal with this Northern Ireland protocol that's seeming to sort of go off the rails in many ways. They have no interest in seeing violence in Northern Ireland either. So I think they've been pretty good about just taking the attitude of, we're going to try to work this through. But tempers have flared on both sides as well. So everyone's got to try to, keep it together and think of the long term.
Yeah. Can I ask one other side question, which is, so in after all of your research here, do you feel like you have a sense of where the next big negotiation will be? Because there's obviously annual negotiations for several things, the fishing rights and, and obviously the Northern, the Ireland protocol. Yeah. But do you think that's going to be the largest, or are there other trade regulations that'll come up?
The Northern Ireland protocol is the hottest issue right now, the one that's most prone to violence, and with the fishing rights, a clear second, because there already have been protests and people blocking harbors and I showed the pictures of the violence going on in Northern Ireland. That's basically just, really got to be dealt with first. But there are many issues. And one of which is that the financial services industry, and I think energy, they haven't even started really negotiating the deal for those agreements yet. And that's a big chunk of, services industry in the UK is huge. So, there are just many more things to come. But the paperwork seems to be a common theme, the bureaucracy that has just sort of engulfed everything. And then, put on top of it the COVID-19 pandemic, which has made everything worse on so many levels. So you're dealing with both of those things at the same time. But yeah, I guess if you ask me right now, the one I said that really needs to be figured out is the Northern Ireland issue.
Yeah. Okay. We'll look out for it.
See what you can do about that.
All right.
All right, let's jump into some questions from the audience. James asks, would you say that the pro-Brexit advocates oversold and misrepresented the reality of Brexit and the impacts that it would have on Britain?
If you're asking my personal view, yes, I do feel that the Leave campaign it's a fascinating thing to study. They had very charismatic leaders, people like Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, very good at making things seem like, oh my gosh, this is the end of the world if we don't do this. The issue is black and white. We just have to do this, get Brexit done. Whereas the Remain campaign, people like David Cameron were more kind of milquetoast, vanilla type bureaucrats. They had sort of a negative campaign saying, well, if we leave the European Union, this, that, and the other thing will happen. And people just kind of said, yeah, many people just sort of said, yeah, that doesn't really speak to me as much. Nigel Farage is a very interesting character. He's a person that many people said they'd love to go have a beer with, even if they don't agree with him politically, and they had a lot of things that they exaggerated, they oversimplified. There was a famous incident of a bus, the NHS, the National Health Service bus, this big red bus that went around and basically said, I forget what the amount was, but it was like 200 million pounds or something to the EU. We could give that money to the National Health Service. And that was a very simplified, jingoistic thing to say, and people believed it. And then right after the referendum, Nigel Farage was on a news program, and the woman said, that money is not going to the NHS, right? And Nigel Farage basically said, well, no, it's not, and she was like, what do you mean it's not? You told everyone that it was. So yeah, they were playing on a lot of insecurities that people have, economic insecurity after the Euro crisis, people who suffered from, who weren't winners in globalization were feeling economically unstable. There was a security crisis in Europe. You may remember different terrorist attacks that happened. There was one in London, a bombing that killed hundreds of people, a couple in Paris. People don't feel physically safe. They're looking for very simple answers. And then there were the cultural things, of course. You may remember that there was the migration crisis of people coming from Syria and other places in the Middle East that sort of flooded into Europe. And Angela Merkel was known, for letting them in and saying we should help these people. But many people were scared of that and said, we already have people coming from the European Union countries, Eastern Europe. We already have a problem with immigration. We don't need any more. And so, that really played into people's fears. And then the Leave campaign was also very good at this sort of historic nostalgia, this idea that, the World War II, the sort of Dunkirk spirit that like we fought the Nazis ourselves. We were alone when the rest of the continent was occupied. We did it ourselves until the Americans came in a couple of years later. We can do this, and so especially for older voters, that really resonated for them. Not younger voters, not so much, but for older voters, this sort of idea of the British spirit being able to do this was very effective. So yeah, they had a great PR, or you might say propaganda campaign, and it was very effective.
It's just funny, all these things that just feel so familiar, the playing on people's insecurities and the nostalgia factor and the exaggeration, oversimplification.
Yeah,
I can't even envision this. Oh, okay. So Bill says, how has Brexit impacted the average British person? And what is support for Brexit within Britain now?
I think it's still it's still divided. I would be interested to see, I don't have in my head right now exact percentages, but I think it's still basically what it was when the referendum came about. I think that for the average person, it depends, if you're a rural person, there are some great benefits to Brexit. The fishermen are getting some of their territory back. They are going to have more control, higher quota. The EU fishermen are not going to be able to go in as much. But the avalanche of paperwork and bureaucracy and it's just not as convenient as it used to be. That has affected many people negatively. Even people who were pro-Brexit have had issues with this type of thing. And again, it gets sometimes the problems of Brexit aren't entirely clear right now, because there's also problems because of the pandemic, and the two can get conflated. It's not always obvious. For example, there's an issue right now with the UK is down like 100,000 truck drivers right now. And so there's been trouble getting gas or petrol to gas stations, and there have been long lines and people fighting at gas stations.
That's had a lot of news coverage here in our country. We've seen that on the news. Yeah.
And so part of that was because not all, but many of the truck drivers were European Union residents, and they ended up going home after Brexit and can't come back, because of the pandemic, have had issues. So it's both of those things together. And so they're trying to figure out, and it's not just truck drivers, but they've been trying to get temporary visas for butchers as well. There are a certain number of pigs that have not yet been taken to slaughter because there's no one to kill them. And so they're just sort of, this is all backing up. And so people aren't, they're talking about you're not going to be able to have your favorite foods at Christmas now because, this sort of backlog. So day to day, I think it's become, harder in the short term. The hope is that over the long term, these issues will be ironed out and it will be a net positive. But like I said, that's, we don't know that yet.
Matt had a question about polling. So during the course of these past 5 years, and as they've been struggling with the growing pains of Brexit, you mentioned that you did know the numbers off the top of your head, but have there been points where the numbers of support have shown fluctuation to the point where they were like, nah, we made a mistake, we shouldn't have done this? Or has it still remained slightly in favor and glad we did this?
Well, I think it depends on where you are. I think it's still a pretty popular idea in England, but it was not popular in Scotland, as I mentioned before, and it's increasingly unpopular in Scotland and in Northern Ireland, not particularly happy right now either. But it varies from country to country and area to area. Again, it wasn't popular at all in London, but in Wales, it was very popular, and I would assume that the numbers in England and Wales are still fairly close to where they were, but I don't know that for sure.
Jane, did you want to jump in with anything before I moved on to the next audience question?
No, I'm fascinated by the idea that it is changing, even when you think of Scotland deciding maybe we should, be independent. And I remember reading in the news after they voted that they would stay. It was because I'm sure what fed into that was the fact that they had seen how the bureaucracy of the kind of thing that they saw with Ireland and the Republic of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, that the bureaucracy between, one land border and another could be quite a threat to their peace, peace and quiet, because the land border in Scotland would have been really affected by that as well.
Yeah. So
that's like us in Canada. Well, why can't we? We just live across the border from Canada. We have, our favorite bar is right across the border.
Right.
Anyway, I just wondered how.
But the border between England and Scotland is really just kind of a sign right now.
Yes.
There's no checkpoints between England and Scotland. So the very idea that you would be backed up at a English-Scottish border is pretty shocking.
Yeah, so I can imagine that Scotland is going to probably vote to be, just continue to be, let's keep it simple.
We'll see. They'd like to vote again. Nicola Sturgeon disagrees with you.
Yeah, right.
Thinks they'll do it.
So my other concern was that, there was such a threat to London that it was no longer going to be the financial hub for Europe anymore. And all these companies were talking about leaving. And you're saying it's really a mixed bag with the COVID. Do you feel like they're still going to maintain a very strong position as still a major, if not the major, most financial hub for the European?
Yeah, I think that London will always be an important financial center, and I don't think that that's necessarily going to change. That said, I agree with Sir Howard, who I quoted earlier, who basically said that London will remain Europe's largest financial marketplace, but it will no longer be the continent's de facto financial center, and that is certainly true as well. People have gone to Frankfurt, Paris, Luxembourg, other places like that. But like I said, European Union's firms now have to have an office in London, whereas maybe they didn't before. So there's a little bit of cross-sectioning there, but it will remain definitely, I think, a strong financial center, but not the center of Europe anymore.
That's sad to hear in some ways. Yeah, thank you. I know we've got another good comment coming up here from David.
We do. David wants to know, well, Dave, we finally have a British person chiming in, so this is great.
Oh, good.
They're in the US. So by the way, if we have any British folks joining us, go ahead and chime in as well. All right, so David says, that was extremely interesting. Thank you. As a British person living in the US, I am pretty sure that many people who voted for Brexit didn't really want to leave the EU. It was a way of giving the UK and the EU a, quote, bloody nose that went badly wrong. Anyway, in terms of judging the success or otherwise of the Brexit decision, I do think that how well the UK and the EU economies recover from the impact of the pandemic will be politically crucial. Do you agree?
Yes, I do absolutely agree. And I also agree with your statement where you said that many people who voted, not many, but a certain number of people who voted for Brexit didn't necessarily, first of all, know what they were really voting for. Secondly, in some cases, I remember seeing an interview with someone who said, yeah, I wanted to remain, but, I wanted to give a signal to the government. So I voted to leave. And I didn't, because I didn't think it would pass. I thought it would just be a protest vote. And now it's passed and I'm shocked. I wish I could take my vote back. I wouldn't say that's a majority of people, but there were a number of people. And actually, right after the referendum, I think there was someone said that the most Googled phrase in the UK was, what does it mean to leave the European Union? Or something similar to that. People just didn't really, some people just didn't really know what they were voting for or didn't take it seriously enough.
I had a quick question before we wrap up. If you could speak a little bit about organized crime and if there's been any uptick in smuggling or engagement with black markets that's been notable since Brexit. It seems like there'd be a lot of temptation from the organized crime world to get their hands on all this.
Yeah, I don't have specific knowledge of that, but I think you're absolutely right that it makes sense that they might take advantage of the situation. I mean, even just, hearing about people making fake, COVID vaccine cards and that type of thing. There's got to be a market for fake customs paperwork and, who knows, but I'm sure that they absolutely are trying to take advantage of it as much as possible.
Well, somebody's got to be on that smuggling of the British sausages that you were mentioning earlier.
Right.
You got to get your sausages.
I'm your guy for the sausages.
That won't be
tolerated.
Bangers. Exactly. All right.
I don't know if you saw, Julie, I just wanted to do one more because Stu came in with an interesting question,
Go ahead.
which was the 72% that voted for in the referendum, and what was the interpretation of the 28% that opted out of voting?
So why did they opt out of voting? Or?
Yeah. Or what
Well, I
was it?
actually think, it was a pretty high percentage. If you think about elections in the United States and other places, 72% turnout is pretty high.
Yeah.
So many people who don't vote are people who think that, the system is rigged and my vote doesn't matter. There are some people who think that way, that, it's not going to work for me either way. So what do I care, whether we stay or whether we go? Other people, may have, been working and not able to vote, or, there's any number of reasons why people don't vote. But I think in general, 72% is pretty good.
It is, and I would just like to point out, I think that your statement about someone who said I did it as a protest vote to leave, that maybe there were the 28% thought it was already a given that they were going to remain.
That was going to remain. So what was the point?
Yeah. So no big deal.
Yeah. Some of them are regretting.
And Stu, I think that's a good question. Right.
Well, thank you. We've gotten through the questions, and I think that, we've gone over our hour now. So I know it went by very quickly. Jane, before we wrap up, do you want to real quick mention some upcoming events or anything about the conference?
Our next is November 16th, if I read the calendar correctly. And we have engaged Ambassador Ann Hall, who I think she was an ambassador for Lithuania, but she had many, many posts in Eastern Europe, et cetera, and I'll be there to give an introduction to her. That I promised to shorten it, but she's a very experienced State Department spokesman. She is retired now, up to Blue Hill, and I think that would be it'll be wonderful to see where she thinks that Europe is today. And I know she's going to take it as a where are we today kind of perspective. So I look forward to that. And Andrea, thank you so much for taking it. So we all appreciate it very much, as I can see in the comments. We're all feeling enlightened.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And again, we want to mention that you can register for upcoming Camden Conference community events by visiting camdenconference.org. You can also find them at librarycamden.org/events on our events calendar. We have a lot of other wonderful talks coming up, not just Camden Conference. Sometimes we talk about history, sometimes we talk about nature. So check out all the great things we have coming up very, very soon. I want to remind you that we have recorded this program. So if you would like to share it, you can find it on the Camden Conference website, and you can also find it on the Camden Public Library Program's YouTube channel. All right, that's a mouthful. Okay, everyone, thank you again for showing up tonight. Thanks, Andrea. This has been very, very enlightening, and you just did a beautiful and concise job pulling it together. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Jane, I'll see you soon, and all the rest of you out there, I hope to see you soon as well. Take care. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thank you, Julia.